For today, maybe just first of all, thank you to everyone who has actually managed to join. Hopefully you've joined for a reason and knowing what the title is, so I probably don't need to re-emphasize that. But there are a few things that we're going to go through today to look around enterprise architecture and business architecture and essentially see how they can be combined to provide better outcomes or at least better deliverables for organizations. So there's some quick introductions that I will run through, just introductions of myself and obviously the company here, Avolution, and then we'll dive into some of the aspects around EA and BA, and then we'll actually take a quick look at a specific use case towards the end, including, as usual, time for questions. So if there are any questions, as mentioned, please put those into the chat window, and we should have time at the end to come back to those. So from the company perspective, so I'm here on behalf of Avolution. I'm the pre-sales lead at Avolution. What that typically means is helping customers achieve different goals and outcomes using Abacus, which is a market leader for enterprise architecture, and it's the tool that we offer many customers across many different industries. And we've been doing this for about 20 years. I've been at Avolution for probably close to half of that. And we've worked across, as I've mentioned, many different industries and domains with thousands of users with multiple use cases. And it's a global operation. I'm speaking to you here from close enough to London, I guess. But we also, of course, have offices worldwide over in Australia and America also, where we have obviously global customers that we interact with. Now, as a enterprise architecture tool, I don't want to spend too much of these slides giving you a pitch of the tool, but it is worth emphasizing how the tool is structured, because effectively we are providing a solution that enables users across any domain, whether it's business analysts, enterprise architects, cybersecurity teams, process analysts, mostly organizations that actually want to manage the complex nature of their enterprise. And so we offer two platforms here. We offer Abacus Studio and Abacus Enterprise, and both of these go hand in hand in trying to make sure that we can democratize data collection throughout the organization and, of course, address many other use cases that customers are working towards. Like I mentioned, this isn't a tool pitch, so if you want to know more information about Abacus itself, feel free to reach out to me or the team, and we'll be happy to give you a more detailed view of the tool and its capabilities. But today, we are talking about enterprise architecture and business architecture. For a lot of organizations, there are a number of things to consider here, but really, if we take a look at the big picture, there are a number of different goals and objectives that we're trying to achieve, and of course, we're trying to measure how well we're performing against those goals. And the questions that we might ask is whether this is actually an enterprise architecture view or a business architecture view. Now, commonly, we might also push that a bit further and think, well, is it actually a combination of both? To understand if it's a combination of both EA and business architecture, we probably first need to look at a couple of definitions around what we mean by business architecture and enterprise architecture. I'm sure many of you on the call don't need a definition for this, but it's worth starting from this perspective to see what we can actually drill down into later on. A few years ago, there was a great article actually, which was, I think it was maybe the title Business Architecture versus Enterprise Architecture. And this was, if I remember correctly, John Mahan, perhaps, who offered this arguably relatively simplistic view of what business architecture and enterprise architecture actually is. Fundamentally, he said that business architecture really is what a business does, and enterprise architecture is what a business knows. And so we're going to deep dive into a couple of these aspects to show you how those two areas can actually be combined, and of course the benefits later on of diving into both. Now, from a business architecture perspective, one of the fundamental things that we really look for from a BA is it's really just a blueprint of the organization, a structured, arguably model-driven approach to building and managing an organization. It doesn't just define the actual outcomes of the architecture, but it also is there to help realize those outcomes as well. So realistically, we're trying to represent this holistic view of an organization purely from a business perspective. There are different stakeholders involved, products we're developing, services that we're offering, strategies and policies, processes and capabilities. All of these might typically fall within that business architecture domain. It often also enables the whole concept of strategy to execution. So of course, we aren't just maintaining the business blueprint, we're also trying to execute on that as well. There are a number of different models out there. BizBook is hopefully a good reference that some of you may be familiar with in terms of the business capabilities and the business domains, I guess, the architects will work in. So again, this is just a great overview of all of those separate, almost let's say lenses across that business architecture view. So what the organization does, how it does it, and why it does it is essentially one of the areas that something like BizBook and other frameworks can offer some advice on. We'll touch on more specific frameworks later towards the end on how they can actually support business architecture and enterprise architecture. And again, as I've mentioned, business architects aren't just designing those specific blueprints, they are there to help execute and implement those as well. We obviously want to realize as BAs how we actually make those models a reality. Now, there's a stat here where it says 70% of organizations, or at least business transformations, end in failure, usually due to the lack of a successful implementation. And there are different factors that go into those specific digital transformation projects and programs that are running. But as we've seen here, successful implementation is really an issue. And business architecture, of course, is here to help with some of that as well. And so the main problem is actually implementing the ideas efficiently. And as the famous quote goes, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. So Mike Tyson there really just summing up, I guess, more of a practical reality. But from a business perspective, of course, coming up with these ideas are usually relatively straightforward and relatively easy. The idea is actually implementing those ideally in a much more efficient way. So again, those business ideas aren't really the problem, it's the execution of them. Hence the idea that business architecture really should be there to enable the execution of that strategy. Now, from an enterprise architecture perspective, there are a couple of areas in here, and we have maybe just a common definition from Gartner on this particular slide, but traditionally, and arguably maybe even the same these days, enterprise architecture falls more into, let's say, the technology landscape. And there are different schools of thought, of course, where EA might stem from, and it's probably not too much of a surprise that it's within those IT domains. But enterprise architects really are providing a much higher level view of the entire organization. We really are there to help actually understand those business visions and outcomes that we're trying to achieve and utilizing technology to achieve those. It may have been in the past the other way around, but of course these days that is certainly what we're trying to push towards, building deliverables from a system or from a model based on both business and IT concepts. And again, just to re-emphasize, business architecture isn't just process modeling, and enterprise architecture isn't just about technology either. There are implications to both of these, and certainly we feel, and the experience that we've had with customers, is that they shouldn't be in isolation, of course. So where does enterprise architecture really come into business architecture? Well, typically, these are the, let's say, 4 domains that most organizations would categorize their enterprise within. We have business, data, application, and technology. And so again, we're not really treating EA and BA separately here. The idea is that there's a combination of the domains that those two architecture areas focus on. And the combination of those is what effectively leads to an efficient, a performant organization or enterprise. There are always going to be times when certain organizations might have a more specific focus on a certain area. Some organizations might start with business architecture because that's their focus, maybe first of all. But really, there are combinations of introducing enterprise architecture into those functions that can be of benefit. And so what I want to do is take you through, let's say, a fictitious example to some extent, although it's one I've worked with companies on before. And at the end, I mentioned I'll take you through maybe more of a real use case as well. But there was a common situation, let's say, for lots of financial institutions where, especially as new fintechs arise, there are different capabilities and services they offer to more traditional banks. And one of those areas initially was the idea of paying checks into an organization, to a bank. And traditionally that was, you receive checks and there's this, let's say, wall in place where we'd have to physically enter a branch, physically speak to someone in person, and then physically sign something to actually check those within the organization. There are different areas where business architecture and enterprise architecture come together for actually designing a new service here. So the new service might be to leverage mobile applications. And one of the business areas that might be a focus here is we have goals and objectives to actually retain customers against competitors who already have capabilities of paying checks in digitally. Now, the how of that is what most organizations would go through in this case, the same check process, this time potentially taking images of those checks that get sent. We analyze those images, and then ideally we're passing those through different processes, storing them, and arguably at the end, there may be some automation behind that as well. So the business objective is, let's retain customers by introducing new services such as this to hopefully avoid losing customers to competitors. So from a pure business architecture perspective, there's certain processes we want to actually manage, new processes that we build internally. In this case, we're offering new capabilities. We have a good strategy in place to achieve these types of goals and why we want to achieve them. But then we can also introduce more of an enterprise architect perspective across all of these different areas. Because when we pass those new processes and capabilities in place, we also have to think of the risks. Risks associated with using mobile phones to take pictures of checks. We also need to utilize new or existing applications to actually process those images. We also need to think about the storage of that data. And storing that data and understanding that data requires more team members and more departments to be involved. We have IT teams, cybersecurity, regulators, legal teams, all of which now need to be involved in part of that process. And ultimately, we might be looking at different vendors and technology platforms, cloud architectures in place to actually enable this type of functionality. And all of these come hand in hand from an EA perspective. So from a pure business architecture view, it's great to understand how we're actually delivering services to achieve those goals. But as EAs come into play, we are taking a look at more of the holistic enterprise and understanding all of those implications across the model. And of course, these get packaged up as services or products that then can be delivered to the customer. So again, keep in mind, this is just an example of that combination of business architects and enterprise architects, combining the knowledge that they have, understanding how the organization works, understanding what's already in the organization and can be reused across these different areas. Now, there are certain benefits to, of course, combining these two different domains as well. The key thing is, from a business architecture perspective, of course, there's a business focus by definition of its name, But really by embedding this within this entire enterprise architecture function, we really emphasize that strategy to execution phase. And the idea is that different stakeholders will have different views across the data that we bring into the tool and across data into different models or architectures that we build that allow this lensed approach. We may take one view of the architecture purely business, one view pure technology, maybe one view pure on data. But the idea is with a combination of these, we can actually build a more connected model to enable people to actually drill down into each of these different areas. The other key thing is maybe from a metric perspective, all of the content we're producing, the models we build, they're there to actually build some deliverables and actually make decisions from. So whether it's a cost-benefit analysis of the services and capabilities we're delivering, new technologies we're implementing, new strategic direction for the company, really the idea is that we want to run that analysis against that data. And again, that requires both business and technical aspects to consider. And finally, of course, by combining these two different domains, we are looking at more kind of cross-disciplined architecture views, where we are introducing and involving many more people across the organization so that they can actually start contributing to that data. So a number of different benefits there, but I think, certainly from our experience of working with customers, there's a good word to pin on the end of the word architecture, which is what we call actionable architecture. There isn't always a need to build something for the sake of building it. It's really just the idea of doing the right things at the right time for the right reasons. And there are 4 different areas that we've seen with working with customers that these fall into. So we think of the context, we think of a collaborative environment, we think of connected data, and then we make sure it's consumable. And there are different ways that we can address each of those, but really the key thing is that final one is making it consumable. If we're building actionable architectures and we're building views for certain stakeholders, both across business, IT, we want to make sure that users actually have access to that and can then start making some decisions from that data. One of the ways of doing that is building dashboards. So from a context perspective, the idea behind this part is that you want to make things clear. You want to make sure that when you are building architectures that there's a specific purpose for it. We are defining the correct scope, and there's maybe a specific time period for those as well. The collaborative side, again, hopefully by definition of its name, is making that data accessible to everyone. So if we think about business architects and enterprise architects, we might think of those as 2 separate teams within the organization. In reality, what we want enterprise architecture to be these days is much more collaborative. We want members from all over the organization accessing this data. We want them to contribute to the information. We want them to own their data sets and their views and feel like they're actually contributing to that model. So again, from a business architecture perspective and an EA perspective, combining just 2 teams is a good starting point. But of course, over time, you want this to be truly collaborative across the entire organization. And then we talk about connectiveness. So again, this is making sure that there are levels of interactions across the data. So we're looking at different domains. We're looking at maybe specific configuration management around how that data is collected. And all of that hopefully leads to this idea of increased efficiency and agility. The idea that there's an area where users can collaborate, there's context behind that, and that they can see how each of these different data sets are connected to each other. Very similar to that example of checks paying in I made earlier on. The connectiveness there is the idea that we have new services and capabilities, and we want to be able to see what technologies support them, what infrastructure is in place, what regulations are we abiding by, what policies do we have. Again, this enterprise-wide view of the organization. And the consumable part is again reusing the dashboards, but making sure that they are from the perspective of a certain user. So if we have certain stakeholders who are interested in, let's say, data, specifically around maybe the classification of the data and the security of that data, the idea is that we want to tailor a dashboard for those stakeholders. Again, this is a combination of both business architecture and enterprise architecture. At a high level, we're capturing general information about the data we're collecting. At a low level, we're interested in where that's stored. Is there duplication of that data? What technologies are in place? What risks are there? What vendor life cycles do we need to take into consideration? So we can always have this top-down view, but we can also allow users to jump in at any level if they are interested in those specific domains first. And on the final dashboard, this idea of continuous improvement. Now, if we have context for these views, we have this collaborative environment for users to interact with the data. We have the connected nature of business architecture and enterprise architecture working together, and users are consuming this through easily navigable dashboards and data that's relevant to them, then there's naturally going to be a continuous improvement internally. And we want to be able to make sure that by combining both of these disciplines, that the organization improves efficiency, performance, cost savings. These are, I guess, some of the key benefits that we would typically find most organizations would achieve. Now, dashboards like this are all well and good, but I think the key thing maybe to look at is an example use case of a customer who has utilized Abacus in this type of way. And less salesy again, I guess, but maybe not pure from an Abacus perspective. The important thing here is the type of views they've created, the approach that they've taken to model different environments, and then the success criteria that they have at the end of that as well. So this case study is on a customer called NXP. And really what they've done is they've leveraged Abacus to model information, application, technology, and business aspects within their organization. For those of you who aren't familiar with NXP, they are a semiconductor manufacturer based over in the Netherlands. So they produce what's classified as integrated circuits, which is what everyone has in their pocket right now in their phone. And they are the #1 supplier in the automotive industry for these types of items. So cars, airbag sensors, remote access keys, things like that. These are the type of areas that they would work in. And they're also a leader in that type of field as well, with a number of different employees worldwide, and clearly a great employer to be working for. However, NXP's objectives were split out into what they've classified as primary and secondary objectives. So the first thing was there were a number of risks, which they weren't too sure about what the impact would be because they didn't have this holistic view of their enterprise. As an organization, they were also going through a number of different merger and acquisitions at the time, and they wanted to improve how they actually view their technology landscape and business landscape using a tool to support that. Their secondary objectives was actually improving the quality of the work that they already produced. Like most organizations, they were doing something, whether it was PowerPoints or Excel spreadsheets, they were modeling something to do with their organization, but they really just wanted to make sure that there was a single repository for this. And quite importantly here is to have a common language across the organization. And we'll come back to this later on as well. So what they've done is they've actually set what we've called as a base. And one of the reasons for this is that common language. For a lot of organizations, when they're modeling, whether it's a business perspective, like I mentioned BizBook earlier on, or if we take an organization-wide view using something like Archimate, or again, maybe a more tailored specific view for certain users like BPMN for process modeling, there are a number of different notations and frameworks that can be combined to get to the same outcome. However, what they've done is they've chosen something that their organization and users are familiar with. Archimate is used extensively throughout the organization. BPMN was the processing standard that they used, And so obviously they decided to combine both of these to provide that overall view of the organization. Now, both of those can be quite extensive in terms of their notation. So they've also applied different levels to these. And this again comes back to these type of stakeholder views. As a business architect, I may just be focusing on that strategic layer. As an enterprise architect or maybe a solution architect, I'm kind of looking for a slice through all of those layers and the services and products that support each of those areas as well. And finally, like we've seen on some of the examples, they concluded that dashboards, of course, was the best way of producing their views, not in some kind of external tool or hidden documents, publicly making this accessible to everyone in their organization, so that if there was something that needed to be changed, they were made aware of that as soon as possible. So setting that base, as I mentioned, was key to suit their stakeholders. There was a number of different internal discussions that they had on how best to map things. And these type of activities are, again, quite common in many organizations. And what they've also found is there isn't always a need to use the entire models. So certainly those of you hopefully are familiar with things like Archimate and TOGAF, and you've heard us talk about this in the open group before, but there are different ways that you approach those frameworks and how to use them. And at the start, it might not be using them in their entirety. And so what NXP decided to do was to set a leveled approach to modeling their architectures. So they have different functional models and different process models. And again, this is just maybe from a business perspective, but this was their key focus early on, building several layers into their organization so that you can drill down into the layer that's appropriate to the questions that you're asking. So if I wanted to go through my capabilities, see which processes support those, and understand which data those processes needed, I could stop at that level. Or if I needed to, I could go further and understand what technology do we have that supports those? Where's the high level of vendor concentration? What infrastructure do we have? We need to move some of these services to cloud. This again is where the combination of the business architecture and enterprise architecture remains a crossover. And then finally, they combined all of that data into dashboards, which we've already shown, which allows those users to actually navigate through those views. Again, coming back to the idea of this context to these views, we're making sure that people can actually communicate to each other. They're collaborating on a single environment, let's say, and it's actually consumable for any level of the organization, all the way from CIOs who want to actually get the top-down views of certain metrics, down to anyone who maybe is in the cybersecurity team and needs to understand risks with decommissioning applications or technologies further down the line. So that really is how NXP supported both, like I've mentioned, the business architecture and the enterprise architecture domains. And that's also keeping in mind that they have specific roles internally for those as well. Specific EAs, specific BAs, and they, of course, were working together to produce these views. So not in isolation, which is maybe a common pitfall, I guess, that you can do both, but they still might be in isolation. You want to make sure there's a combination of work that's being passed across each of those levels as well. Now, we've mentioned a couple of frameworks that can be put in play to help support enterprise architecture and business architecture. And there are a number of different notations, meta models, and strategies that you can actually use. Each have pros and cons, of course, and each have maybe the specific areas that we should be focusing on. But it is an important aspect of what we deal with many of our customers on, which is setting a standard in the first place. Quite often, customers might think they have a very unique view of their organization, and they may start modeling their own architectures, building their own frameworks and meta models, and might quickly realize that they've just reinvented the wheel of existing models and notations. So the recommendation, of course, is to always use some of these pre-configured assets. They do act as almost like an accelerator from an enterprise architecture perspective. You really want to be utilizing these in the best way possible. And when I say utilize in the best way possible, it comes back to this idea that they should almost be used as a toolbox where we really want to be extending these and not necessarily jumping in and using it all at once. TOGAF is close to maybe an 800-page standard. That doesn't mean you sit there and read the entire standard. You use the areas that are necessary. If you search for something, you find it in TOGAF, it's very likely that it's going to be useful to you as an architect. But again, it might also be the idea that you start combining these together. And of course, we've seen some of the great work that the Open Group have done over the years with tailoring these standards and pushing them closer together in some aspects, and the introduction of new standards as well. The Open Group also have very specific business architecture standards that can be useful. And these specifications, like Archimate, also go hand in hand with helping the modeling aspects, just like you've seen from the NXP standard use case there as well. Finally, it is probably worth mentioning in terms of a certification process as well. Those standards are really useful to know of, but there's a certification process for tools and users alike. And this is an important aspect, I think. There's the level of being able to know about something like TOGAF and Archimate, but its implementation is what matters. And of course, in any trends these days, these standards will hold up to their own. TOGAF in an agile organization is something that we've seen consistently across our customer sites as well. So we really do want to emphasize that these frameworks exist. We should be using them as much as we can, as and when necessary, but not using them in their entirety for the sake of it. Okay, so the idea is to tailor the organization, tailor the frameworks to suit the type of area that you work in. And when it comes to business architecture and enterprise architecture, a quick search in TOGAF will tell you that all those areas exist and can be combined together. Each have their own viewpoints, each have their own deliverables, and each, of course, have their own benefits when combined as well. So hopefully that gives you a relatively high-level view, I'd say, of some of the aspects of business architecture and enterprise architecture. As usual on these types of calls, we do have some time for questions, but just before that, maybe a quick thank you to everyone who's joined so far. And the idea, again, is if you do have further information on anything we've touched on today, any other WebExes that we've provided with the Open Group in the past as well, please feel free to reach out. But with the time remaining, I will pass over to a Q&A session, and we should hopefully have some questions coming in.
Hi, Andrew. Steve Philp here. Thanks very much for yet another excellent presentation. We've got a few questions coming in as we kind of speak. So what we'll do is we'll try and get through as many as we can. We've got a good amount of time left. And just to reiterate, some of the people have been asking about recordings. Yeah, we'll have a recording of the webinar and this copy of the slides on our Open Group library in the next few days, and we'll send out a notification of that to everybody who's registered. I believe Avolution also will send out slides if they get requests for them. So let's have a look at the Q&A. We can start with, there's a couple in the actual Q&A. What's your, from Bora this is, what's your view regarding the difference of business architects, enterprise architects and solution architects, and how they can work together without stepping over each other?
Yeah, good question. I mean, each are going to have their own specific requirements, let's say, and the specific areas that they actually work in within the organization. So if we think of solution architecture as we're developing solutions for a specific purpose, let's say, we can do that in isolation, and we can develop specific solutions for that purpose. I think there's a common thing, I guess, which is for most organizations or large organizations, they are still relatively siloed. And what typically happens is you find yourself working on something that's suitable and what's best for your business area without maybe the overall view of what's best for the customer or the entire enterprise. So if solution architects are working on individual solutions, businesses purely focus on strategy and objectives and goals. And the enterprise architect is trying to pull those two things closer together so that we have a like I've mentioned, a more holistic view of the organization.